Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar. You have stepped into a course that is going to change the way that you look at data. Not just how you analyze it, but also how you communicate it. My name is Nivid Desai. I serve as the program executive at Writing Studio IIT Gandhinagar. Welcome to Writing for Data Science. This course is at the intersection of analysis and communication. As all of us know, data analysis is not just about coding and models. It is about solving real-world problems. And that is exactly why every single thought that goes into solving those problems needs to be communicated. And not just to one audience, across multiple stakeholders. That is where this course comes in. This course prepares you with the foundations of writing, especially curated for data science. We will discuss audience analysis, critical thinking, logical reasoning, as well as storytelling that is native to data science. So join me on a journey at the intersection of numbers and narratives. I'll see you in class. Namaste, hello and welcome to Writing for Data Science. My name is Nivid Desai and we are on a journey to explore the interesting intersections between numbers and narratives. In the last lecture, we looked at some key techniques to evaluate our sources and claims. Now that we have that in order, the next order of business is building strong arguments with data. Whenever we are looking at argumentation within data science, it becomes a rather tricky business to understand why they matter and what their role is in making sure that our data arguments are compelling. So today, we will look at the importance of building strong arguments in data science and some techniques to ensure that our arguments are not only correct but also convincing. So let's begin with why strong arguments matter in data science. In data science communication, you aren't just presenting facts. You are building arguments. Why should somebody believe your insight? Why should they take action based on your model? Why should they invest in the change that you are proposing? A strong argument connects evidence to conclusion clearly, logically, and convincingly. Weak arguments, even with accurate data, lose trust, create confusion, and block decision making. At this point, I must emphasize that weak arguments do not mean incorrect arguments. I'm not talking about correct or incorrect, right or wrong. I'm not talking about those kinds of dichotomies or binaries. I am in fact talking about the inherent strength, the inherent compelling nature of your argument to get across the point as effectively as possible. An argument can cite the correct data, use the correct sources, and be as accurate as possible. But if it is not strong, it cannot become effective. It cannot become convincing. Here's a reflection for you before we begin today. Think of a time when a good idea was ignored because it was not explained clearly. What could have helped? How could it have been made better? That's the playing area that we are exploring today. It is not about right or wrong. It is not about correct or incorrect. It is about the strength of convincing. Let's first begin understanding what is in fact a strong argument with data. A strong argument is not just about having numbers. A weak argument can also have numbers. It is about reasoning plus evidence plus clarity. It must include a clear claim, as in what you are saying, a solid evidence, as in what supports it, and a logical connection, as in how the evidence supports the claim. It should also have the acknowledgement of limits, as in the honesty about the weaknesses of your argument or about the data that you are citing. And in the end, as we have discussed in the previous module, it should have an audience focus, as in it should be relevant to their needs and their values. Here's an example. A weak argument can be something like, our app is better because user numbers are higher. It is unclear. There is a claim, but it is not as strong. There is no evidence to support this claim. There is no acknowledgement of limits. And it is also a tall claim, not focused on the audience, but almost attacking the audience with something as aggressive as a competitive advantage because of higher number of users. So here is the strong version. User growth increased by 23%, specific evidence, after UX improvements, suggesting higher satisfaction. However, more analysis is needed to confirm retention impact. This is also highlighting the weakness of your present observation and the possibilities of further exploration. So yes, user growth has increased, but will they stick around? Will they continue to be users for a long time? That remains to be seen. And you must acknowledge that. That is what makes a strong argument. Here's an exercise for you. Write a claim about a model's accuracy. Then improve it by adding evidence and a cautious tone. By cautious tone, I mean acknowledging weaknesses. In fact, just because we are acknowledging weakness, we are being cautious about any tall claims or any broad claims that the argument might be making. This exercise will get you closer to the strength of an argument that lies underneath the kind of data that you are presenting. Now that we have understood what a strong argument is, we must start looking at the key components of building a strong argument. Number one, you make a clear and focused claim. Your main point should be specific, not vague or sweeping. For example, a vague claim can be something like, the app helps users. Obviously, it does. Obviously, that is the purpose of the app. But it doesn't provide anything more than just the obvious statement of fact. That's why it needs to become specific. The app reduces onboarding time by 40%, helping users reach key features faster. This is not only about presenting a random number as data, however accurate it may be. It is about the focus of the claim. If you look at it, we are not just dropping the data point and moving away. We are also talking about why that data point matters. Just because the app reduces onboarding time by 40%, it has a purpose behind it so that the users can reach key features faster. That is the impact. That is the effective nature of the data point that you are dropping in the middle of your sentence. Here's a reflection. Why might a too general, too vague claim confuse or weaken your message? Think about it. Why is it that broad, tall claims that may look romantic almost on the surface don't really work as strong arguments? Once you have a clear and focused claim, you start supporting it with relevant and sufficient evidence. Strong arguments use relevant data, not just random numbers, and enough data to be convincing. Like I emphasized even in the previous point, it is not just about using data as placeholders. It is about making them relevant and making them useful to the kind of argument that you are building. And not just one or two instances. You use data insofar as it is enough to prove the point that you are trying to make. Here's an example. A weak argument would be something like one user said they loved the new update. This is known as an anecdotal claim or an anecdotal evidence. This is because the sample size is all of one and it is not even verifiable. You can't track who the user is, you can't go and check whether they actually said that, and you can't check whether there is any logical basis for this claim being made right here. In the place of a weak supporting statement, here's a strong one. In a survey of 2,500 users, 78% preferred the new interface over the old one. So if you look at it, this uses data not only as a placeholder, but as an effective mode of communicating the specificity of the evidence that you are presenting. It is not only dropping one number and then running away from it. It is actually using as much detail as possible to enrich the argument further. It is talking not only about the sample size of the survey, but also the results of the survey in two very different data point manners. That is what makes an argument diverse and therefore strong. Here's a little exercise for you. Imagine that you are claiming a model improved performance. What two types of evidence could you add to strengthen your case? Now that we have understood that evidence is not just data for the data's sake, try to think about the different kinds of evidence that you can bring in to strengthen the case that you're making. Now we arrive at the third key component. You connect the evidence to the claim with clear reasoning. We looked at logical reasoning in our first primer, and here we look at it in action. Don't just assume the link between the evidence and the claim because it is obvious. You have to explain it. You cannot rely that the reader will connect the dots by themselves. I often tell my students, you don't have to give them 2 plus 2. You have to give them the 4 as well. For example, the bad connection is, we had more users this month, therefore the new feature is successful. However, this lacks any kind of information that can connect the claim with the evidence. The good connection would be, new feature A launched on June 1st, specific. Post-launch, active users increased by 22% compared to a 3% average monthly growth rate over the past year. This is not only adding data for data's sake once again, it is using the link between the claim and the evidence to connect the audience's understanding. It is making the data come alive with reasoning. And that is what matters. It is not just about dropping data just to prove your point. What if the audience does not understand that the point is proven? You have to prove it for them. That is why a link between the claim and the evidence is made stronger with reasoning. Reflect on this question before we move forward. Why is it dangerous to leave connections between your points unstated? Think about it. What will happen if different audiences start interpreting different connections between the claims that you're making? What kind of consequences can be drawn from there? That will make you realize why this reasoning plays a crucial role in making your argument stronger. Arriving at the fourth key component, we address assumptions and limitations. Showing that you recognize the gaps or possible flaws actually builds credibility. It is not only about letting the chinks in your armor show, you also have to ensure that you communicate these as effectively and clearly as possible. And there is no harm or threat to your credibility when it comes to showing these kinds of assumptions or flaws. In fact, your reader will trust you further just because you have added these details to not misguide them and not mislead them in the longer run. The reader will look at this as a mark of authenticity and honesty. Here's an example. While the engagement rate rose by 18% post-campaign, seasonality effects such as holiday promotions may also have contributed. This ensures that you are dropping the data, of course. You are communicating the observation and the claim. However, you are also adding a factor that may have also affected the outcome that you have reported. This is an assumption that you're making and you are absolutely clarifying it, that there is a limitation to my conclusion. You are not giving a tall claim that my conclusion is the correct conclusion. You are also making sure that your reader understands that there is an assumption being made there is a limitation within data, and the communicator has made it clear to them. Here's a quick exercise. Write a sentence describing a data insight and then add one limitation or assumption that would make it cautious or credible. There is an observation that you have made. There is a conclusion that you have arrived at. But what kind of limitation or assumption would you add to make it cautious and credible? Try to write it and check that your fear of judgment starts dissolving as you start becoming honest. In the last key component, we take a nostalgic trip down memory lane of our module on audience analysis. The last key component is, in fact, focusing on what matters to the audience the most. You tailor your arguments to the decisions, values, and concerns of your reader. For example, once again, we come back to our technical and non technical audience understanding. For a technical reader, we highlight precision, recall, AUC ROC metrics. For a business leader, we focus on impact on revenue, customer loyalty, and brand trust. Here are some common pitfalls that I also want to introduce to you in data arguments. For example, there is a chance of overstating causation when it is in fact correlation. Remember, we discussed this as a logical fallacy in our previous lecture. Correlation is not causation. Then, ignoring uncertainty or variability. If a data or a conclusion from the data is uncertain or it varies from different context to context, if you ignore that, it becomes problematic in your eventual conclusion. Then you're using too small a sample size to make big claims. We have also seen these as examples. We looked at some sample sizes which were extremely small and some large claims being made for that. This is also a common pitfall in data analysis. Then the next one is also a callback to our lesson on logical fallacies. Cherry picking only the evidence that supports you. If you remember cherry picking, it is about only selecting the evidence that fits your bias or fits the argument that you are trying to make. And in the end, of course, being too technical for a non-technical audience. I trust that by now you would have gained the kind of skill set necessary to navigate between technical and non-technical audiences. So now we move on to a model framework for how to build strong arguments. Step 1, you make a clear and specific claim. Step 2, you present a strong and relevant evidence. Step 3, you explain the reasoning that links the evidence and the claim. Step 4, you acknowledge assumptions or uncertainties. And step 5, you align with what matters to the audience. That was a rundown of all that we did in terms of the key components. If you just take these 5 steps, it will ensure that your argument becomes stronger. Here's an example for what we just saw. If you look at the claim, our recommendation engine increased click-through rates. That's the claim. The evidence to support it is that A/B testing over 2 months showed a 15% improvement with a 95% confidence level. Now you connect the claim with the evidence. This suggests the new algorithm better matches user preferences. However, you also have to acknowledge the limitation. However, results were tested only in North American users. Global rollout results may vary. Then, in the end, you augment it for audience focus. Higher click-through rates can lead to a 10% lift in ad revenue. This is for the marketing department, right there. So we augment all of this analysis to suit the audience that we're eventually targeting. In the end, I just want to emphasize that good arguments build trust, not just conclusions. In data science, strong arguments are what turn evidence into influence. They show not just what is true, but also why it matters. They make your insights actionable, credible, and respected. And they create bridges between your analysis and your audience's decisions. In the end, that is what we are aiming for our data to not just sit on paper, but to also influence the decisions that our target audience is making based on recommendations, suggestions, and predictions. That was it from my end for this lecture. We were looking at how to build strong arguments in data science. In the next lecture, we will look at structuring claims, evidence, and warrants. Stick around for that because we are learning a new word in the next lecture as well and diving deeper into critical thinking and logical reasoning. I hope that the module has been fun so far and we are having some insightful learnings carrying home with this. I will see you in the next lecture. Until then, all the best, stay curious, and keep learning. Thank you so much for joining me today. Namaskar.